Welcome to Challenging the Notion of Efficient in Meetings. This is part 2 of a 3-part series. Welcome to those who were with us for part 1. I hope you enjoy part 2 and will join us again for part 3. Today, what we're going to be looking at are some of the barriers to implementing what we talked about in part 1. So part 1 being demystifying the notion of generative governance. Part 2 focusing on some of those barriers, specifically and most importantly, the barrier of efficiency as a driver in meetings. And then part 3, we're going to get down into all the nitty-gritty kinds of things, from agendas to room setup to physical needs to all those sorts of things that can get in the way of generative governance, quite honestly. So today we're specifically, again, going to be talking about efficient in meetings. And we start from the same place we did last time, the works of Drs. Chait and Ryan and consultant Taylor from BoardSource back in the early aughts, as was followed up by Kathy Trower about 10 years later. You know, we're going to be talking about conventional wisdom and where it serves and doesn't serve, and some tips for flipping the script. But really, we're talking about 3 barriers to generative governance. One is a ruthless dedication to efficiency in meetings. The second is a false premise, an assumption that we're aligning management and government behaviors and activities and that they can be aligned. And the third being, gosh, we have just such deep habits that reinforce the status quo that it simply makes it difficult to get from A to B when we're trying to make change. So what's the conventional wisdom, right, about efficient meetings? Let's face it, we all hate meetings. It's my profession. We all hate meetings, right? But maybe, just maybe, we're taught to hate meetings. The management literature, all the top 10 lists are full of screeds and tips, either ditching meetings or rethinking meetings or making them as action-oriented as possible. That action is actually a trap, right? Because that's a management thing. That's not a governance thing, right? So we need to take a step back from all of those screeds, take a breath, and think about it for a minute. Most of them are talking about meetings as task avoidance. They're talking about meetings as looking busy or, giving time back to staff to do their work. That's great. That's perfect. But that's not what we're talking about when we're talking about generative governance. Good governance requires, good generative governance requires time for thoughtful deliberation, space for uncertainty and exploration, permission to change your mind, and so much more. And all of that takes time. So if we're stuck on, a meeting has to get X number of decisions done, or, the best meetings are the ones that come in under agenda, or a meeting has to be an hour, we're trapping ourselves in a box. And that box is going to be difficult to get out of. All right, so before we dive in, we're going to do just the quickest recap from part 1. So part 1, what's generative governance? Generative governance is think first, think hard about what's at issue and what's at stake. As I just mentioned, it's about time to discuss, space to explore, permission to change our minds, and we need to focus to be able to get there so that we can find and frame what is most important to our work. Remember, we've got this curve. We need to move from the beachfront of the immediate decision and action up the bluff to the cabin on the bluff so that we can see what's around us, in front of us and to the sides, and even further up to the headwaters so we can get to root causes. We can see a full 360 back, out, and forward, right? So it's about bringing generative thinking to all of our duties, the fiduciary, the strategic, organizational insight, all of it. We're making sense together. And pools need to care about this because you're just such unique animals. You are so complex. You work in the most uncertain of environments. You're in risk management, for goodness sake. Meaning matters to your members, to the regulators. You need to understand why you're doing things so that you can stay consistent. And you're this fascinating blend of nonprofit, corporate, government, norms and rules and all sorts of things. That was the recap. So now we get to what is my plea for making change, and it's making the case about why we need to think about efficiency in meetings differently, because I need to change your mind. Because I can hear you all right now. My board will kill me if we take longer. My board will this if we do, right? Or the board's saying, just tell us what we need to know so we can get out of here, right? So I need to make the case to you, and that's what I'm doing here. First, psychology and neuroscience are not on our side. We deceive ourselves if we believe that we are acting rationally or thinking through everything when we're making decisions. The truth is 95% of the time we're probably not. We're probably working from what behavioral economists that some of you have read would call system 1. It's that intuition and instinct, as opposed to system 2. The neuroscientists talk in terms of the limbic system, the hypothalamus, the amygdala, all those sorts of things. The truth is, to quote one that I appreciate, every single decision that we make, no matter how logical we think that decision is, was inspired by emotion. Because that's where the information gets into the system. It goes to the emotion first, logic second. So you're instantly having to override your initial reactions, your initial thoughts, in order to get to the logic side of things. What's next? Cognitive bias. Every person has biases, every single one of us, which means that every board has biases. And if you follow the social psychology of all of this, there is a list of at least 200 of them, right? So, you know, we're getting caught coming and going. You've heard some of the names: confirmation bias, hindsight bias, anchoring, halo effect, all that sort of stuff. You're aware of some of this stuff, right? But the reality is that means that each of us, and collectively, we ignore salient facts. We fill in gaps and edit our memories. We generalize based on just the smallest of experience, right? So part 1, psychology and neuroscience is against us. Part 2, we're hardwired with all of these biases that require us to slow down in order to get past. Part 3, we're a room full of individuals with different styles, different personalities, the deciders who are trying to speed us up, the process folks who are trying to slow us down, not to mention all of the tests that you've taken and you've explored and you've thrown away and you've taken, explored again, from Myers-Briggs to StrengthsFinders, back and forth, all that sort of stuff. There's great complexity as individuals in this. And then you put us all together, and all of this creates a culture for the group that is not only those personalities, is not only that psychology, but is all of our history and all of our presuppositions that influence us from every direction. The boardroom is a complicated place. And then we think about the process, right? We are all creatures of habits. And in the boardroom, we're dealing with habits, really deep habits for how we make decisions in our daily lives. And shallow sort of mental grooves and structures for the relationships we have with each other. You're in a room full of acquaintances who are hardwired for their day jobs. I use acquaintances on purpose. because, you know, think about it. How many hours a year do you spend with these people? And how deeply do you get to know each other? An example I use for good or ill is, you know, think about um, if you've got a life partner or heck, a roommate, whatever, someone who you spend an inordinate amount of time with. How long did it take you in that relationship to get good at telling each other the truth, to get good at trusting each other's motivations, at making decisions together, at giving each other the benefit of the doubt? Think of those, how many hours that is. Now think of how many hours you're with this group of people, right? You're acquaintances, and you're all hardwired for the way you do your day job. I always say that, you know, the board is their day jobs. So what kinds of thinking have come into the room? You've got elected officials. What's their thought process, right? You've got public entity administrators. How are they spending their day? What kind of analysis, what kind of cycle are they on? Finance directors, HR directors, right? None of them are governance. I've long said that the act of governance is an unnatural one. We're hardwired for everything but, right? For action, for speed, for all these things, not for deep thinking, not for slowing down, not for the big picture. Okay, Sarah, so what the heck does all of that mean for generative governance, right? It's trying to make the case that we're starting from behind when we're trying to make the switch to generative governance, when we're trying to deepen our thinking and expand the impact of the work of governing bodies. That work requires deep thinking. And again, as I mentioned, we have barriers to overcome. And I hope that in going through the few slides that I just went through, that you see that the barriers aren't about failure or fault or personalities or politics. It's about our wiring. It's about the way we work, right? But the upshot is that we're sacrificing effectiveness for superficial, and I do mean superficial efficiency. And deep down, you all know it. You really do. I hear about it all the time, right? And we see it. You go through a board meeting. I could even name names probably who's in the group. You go through a board meeting or a governing body meeting, and the executive presents an option, and the board talks for like 5 minutes, and then they approve it, and they move on, and everybody's like, "Oh, that's great." And then the next board meeting comes up, and somebody on the board who was part of that conversation says, "We really need to figure this out." And the executive's like, we did. But the fact that the board didn't engage in the information, right? They didn't interrogate the information. They said, "Yep, there you go. That sounds good. Off." It doesn't stick. It just doesn't stick. You gotta stop and absorb the information and ask some questions. I had a colleague once who said, "Anything you ask me in the hallway doesn't exist." It doesn't exist because she's purely reacting and off and gonna have no memory of it. I see it in boardrooms all the time. Again, we also are working on this false premise that all of the management literature and conventional wisdom and best practices about meetings, yes, meetings, is as applicable to our daily lives as it is to board work, and it's just not true. So if you're with me on this, and you start to think about making some changes, we can actually begin to address some typical complaints that are the bane of the sector's existence. Not just pooling, but the entire nonprofit sector, right? Everybody complains about boards, the dysfunction of boards, that they're disengaged or disinterested, that they micromanage, that they don't understand their role, that all these sorts of things. It's just a constant frustration that they're not doing it right. And then on the board side, there's this constant frustration of it's boring, it's time consuming, it's not rewarding the way I thought it was. Just tell me what I need to know. I want to help, please. I want to help, but just let's get this over with. What if 2/3 of that is because we've oversimplified the process, overscheduled the meetings, discouraged real questioning? The whole micromanaging thing, while real and while a problem, is used as this giant boogeyman that just cuts off conversation at its knees. What if we've retained too much of the work with the executives and not enough for the boards, right? What if we're rewarding the wrong things? If that's true, then, there's really some opportunity costs in all of this. I've talked before and I'll talk again. We're trying to make consequential decisions that are durable and that are clear, right? But what we're doing is making fragile decisions that are not durable. And you guys are in risk management. We're injecting a great deal of risk into the process by not being on the same page. So, your board, what do you need? Well, you need to take a step back and take a look at what you've got. What's the complexity in your room? What are the personalities, the culture, the interests, right? What are the pieces that you're working with? There's no one size fits all for this. Some folks will need to go faster, some will need to go slower, but you need to take a step back and sort of assess what you've got, right? And in this group, we've got everything, right? We've got small pools with as few as 20, maybe even fewer. And you've got large pools with probably pushing 1,500 at this point. I don't know what the largest is. And we've got members that are essentially within a 20-mile radius and ones that it takes an entire day to get from the middle to the outside. 2 days to get from either end, right? And sometimes with a plane. We're not talking about easy access here. So know what you've got. Know what you've got. Why does all of that matter? Because again, each one of those things affects your decision on the speed, on time, how much you've got, how fast things need to move, the space you have, literally, distance and agenda, and the space we have in here, right, and in here, and all that sort of stuff. The permission we give ourselves to play around in the mud, to think it through, not to be the devil's advocate, to be a ornery goat, but to interrogate so that we understand and we come to the same place. And it affects what kinds of distractions we're dealing with. We try to disengage and focus as much as possible, but I know we can't fully do that in this world. Not in your jobs. I get that. I get that. Are there ways we can flip the script? Are there ways we can slow down in all of this? I was reading a newsletter just this last week from the Nonprofit Risk Management Center, Melanie Lockwood Herman, if any of you follow her. And the headline was, "Patience is a prerequisite." And I'm just like, yes, that. We have to slow down in order to move fast. So the first thing I encourage us to do is to redefine some terms, or at least go to different parts of it, right? So we're trying to be effective. So getting the results we want by the dictionary. I would say results that are impactful, right? We have to be efficient. So we don't want to waste materials, time, or energy. But what's really wasting? What do we mean? Right? we focus a lot on what's frequently the first definition of waste, which is, not to use something in a way that is not necessary, right? Or to use more than is necessary. That's frequently what we're talking about, right? Using too much time using too much time. What I hope we can do is focus on what's usually the second definition, which is more about using things in a way that produces a valuable result, right? Um, and that is irrespective of time, right? What's the valuable result? If you look at the lean and the agile and all that sort of stuff, um, which we don't want to do here. Don't get me wrong. Um, but that literature and that body of work talks about reducing drag, reducing friction. And in that case, we're talking about not overstressing the system so that it breaks, not overstressing time, same kind of thing, right? Um, because we'll talk about this more in part 3, but what stress does to the psychology and neuroscience, it doesn't take much before you are way out of the rational zone. You'd be astonished at how little it takes for time stress. We want to reduce duplication of effort. That story I told you before about we make the decision and then 2 months later the board forgot that they made the decision, right? That's duplication of effort. Why are we doing that to ourselves? Let's get it right the first time. Are we actually saving time when we're coming back to it 3 and 4 times, right? And errors. Are we assuming we know the data? Are we assuming we know what the data means without taking the time to actually find out? Because we may be completely wrong. And that may lead to some unfortunate decisions, right? So let's focus on using to the greatest effect as efficient rather than making sure we use the least, right? Because effective meetings, in my definition, mean we get to our goal, right? And efficient meetings, in my definition, means that we're using all of the resources in the room. We're not overstressing the time. The original authors of generative governance would argue that it's going to be much more fun and rewarding for board members at the same time because you're going to be engaged and you feel like you're actually doing something and not like, how fast can I click the box, right? Another resource along these same lines that may be useful to you guys to take a look at, Chip and Dan Heath, they've done a number of books over the years. There's one in recent years called Decisive, and I'm ornery about these things, but all the management literature, there half a dozen different books that all are the best things since sliced cheese, that frequently talk about exactly the same thing. Just take the one that you like, right? The one that speaks to you, and this is one of them. So this is, whether it means to or not, it's talking about making better decisions. It's talking about overcoming decision-making biases. So let's widen our options. Let's test our assumptions. Let's get some distance before deciding. So I talk about taking 3 bites of the apple with lots of organizations. Introduce the topic in one meeting, discuss it deeply in the next meeting, and make a decision in the third. When you can do that, you've really engaged the full arc of our bodies and our minds, right? And prepare to be wrong. We all need to be wrong. It needs to be easier to be wrong. It's Socrates to the rescue. There's nothing new under the sun. There really isn't. The questions on the left hand of the screen are questions that I gave you as first steps in part 1 of this series. The questions on the right are sort of a classic Socratic method for decision-making and exploring logic and critical thinking. If you look closely, they're basically the same list, right? So whatever the questions are that resonate with your group, the point of them has to be, are you asking questions that clarify right? Are you asking questions that probe assumptions, reasoning, evidence, viewpoints, perspectives, all of the grounding stuff? Are you asking questions that probe the so what, the what happens next, the ripples, the intended consequences, the unintended consequences, the choice not made, right? All of that sort of stuff. And are you questioning the question, right? Should we even be asking this? Is this the right time? All of that sort of stuff. So whether you're using the questions I gave you before from Chait and Ryan, or you're going to our good old friend Socrates, you're doing the same thing. And the critical step in all of this is to do this kind of interrogation, right? It doesn't have to be long. It can be short. It depends on the topic. But the interrogation is critical, not just to be ornery about it, but for the board members to fully understand what they're doing and adopt it with common meaning that lasts. Some of you have gone through some of Steve Troutman's work with succession planning. If you look at his, we've got the same kinds of questions. So he's looking at a process that's a generative process applied to the succession work, right? I mentioned last time, I'll mention again. Some of you have been through the work with Rebecca Ryan. Same thing. Much of what she's doing, her sense-making Fridays, goodness, what is that, right? These are all about taking a step back or a step up to the headwaters again so that you can see behind you, around you, and in front of you. Again, last time we talked about the shifts. Those same shifts are first steps to think about here. Especially if you think about it the right, take a moment with the table on the right here. As you look at your meetings, as you look at your agendas, ask yourself these questions. Are we choosing for alternatives? Or are we generating alternatives? Are we solving problems? Are we framing problems, right? The work on the left is mostly management. The work on the right is mostly governance and generative governance. There you go. So, small steps. Start somewhere, anywhere. You'll discover wherever you start that there's both a smaller version of it that you can telescope down to or microscope down to, and a larger version of it that you can telescope out to or zoom out or zoom in, right? All of these things telescope, right? So wherever you start, you'll discover both that you started too big and too small. Start. Find more ways to say yes and. Keep parking lots for the future. Don't let things, if something can't have time in a meeting, hold on to it. Find time elsewhere. This isn't about sidetracking meetings. It's really not about sidetracking meetings. It's about finding space to have the right conversations wherever that space is, right? Select a few reflective questions to get yourself started. Don't start with a laundry list. Trust me, I can give you laundry lists. You don't need a laundry list. Start with something, right? Experiment, play. Take the time to reflect afterward and say, okay, we tried that here. That didn't work. We tried this here. That was helpful. Let's you know, we're going to borrow from the Army a little bit and do after action reviews, right? Short, sweet, to the point. Let's do them. There we are. Efficiency in meetings. It's not about how much we can get done and how quickly, but how well we can do it and how well we can use the resources behind it.